Hello, everyone. This is the Racial Justice in the Law series, part 6. We're going to give it about another minute to let everyone log on. Welcome. Okay, I think we're going to get started now. Good afternoon. My name is Olivia Hudnut. I am the Vice Co-Chair of the American Constitution Society's Los Angeles Lawyer Chapter. And I just wanted to welcome everyone here for the 6th event in our Racial Justice in the Law series. ACS Los Angeles has committed to challenging and disrupting systems of oppression by launching a series of events and discussions focused on unpacking and understanding systemic racism within the context of various areas of the law, and as well as sharing recommendations in law and policy that can be uplifted in the movement for equity and justice. Today's discussion will focus on reparations. Over the last year, the Racial Justice in the Law series has convened attorneys, policymakers, and academics from across the United States to discuss the ways racism continues to exist within various areas of the law. We are joined today by a panel of extraordinary individuals who have used legal and policy frameworks to support reparations for Black Americans to redress human rights injustices, including slavery, state-sponsored segregation, oppression, and other forms of systemic racism that are alive today. We would like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors, the Mexican American Bar Association, the Fair Housing Collective, the American Constitution Society Bay Area, San Diego, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Austin lawyer chapters, the ACS OC chapter, as well as the ACS student chapters at USC, UCLA, Pepperdine, and Loyola law schools. Information regarding the California Continuing Legal Education Credit for attending today's event are available on the event page and will also be sent out in an email with the recording of the event following this event. During our event, we will also have a question and answer session, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box anytime during the event. I would now like to introduce our panelists and moderator. And in the interest of keeping things brief, we invite you to look up their more detailed bios after the event. Our moderator today is Professor Jody Armour. Professor Armour is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California, Gould School of Law. He has recently released a book entitled N*GGA Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law. And a link to purchase Professor Armour's book will be added to the chat. He also recently was recognized by the USC Academic Senate with the 2021 Walter Wolf Award for Defense of Academic Freedom and Faculty Rights. Lisa Holder is a dedicated advocate and experienced litigator who provides representation to protect clients' liberty and uphold their civil rights in Los Angeles. Recently, she partnered with Equal Justice Society and Public Counsel to litigate Smith v. UC Regents, which enjoined the UC system from using discriminatory admissions tests, including the SAT and ACT, and prompted the UC's new test-blind admissions policy. She is also a member of California Governor Gavin Newsom's Reparation Task Force. Professor Eric Miller is a professor of law and Leo J. O'Brien Fellow at Loyola Law School of Los Angeles. He recently published an article in Howard's Law Journal entitled Republican Rebellious Reparations and was instrumental in drafting the nuisance lawsuit on behalf of survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre and their descendants against the city of Tulsa and 7 other defendants, demanding accountability and restitution for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre and 100 years of continuing harm. A link to Justice for Greenwood will be added to the chat so you can read more. He is also writing a book on reparations, so keep an eye out for that. Dr. Cheryl Grills is a professor at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where she directs its Psychology Applied Research Center. Dr. Grills is a clinical psychologist who focuses on African psychology, prevention and treatment of mental health with African Americans, community mental health, and applied research with community-based organizations engaged in community organizing on a host of social justice issues. She is also a member of the Governor's Reparations Task Force. And as a note, both Lisa and Dr. Grills' comments and opinions shared on this panel are their own and are not made on behalf of the task force. Thank you to our panelists for being here today. And without further ado, I'll pass the mic to our moderator, Professor Armour.
Thanks so much, Olivia. And wow, I'm looking forward to this discussion today because it really nicely brings together all the other racial justice discussions we've been having throughout the last year and a half almost, hasn't it been, since we embarked on this journey into the nature of systemic racism, how it plays out in housing, how it plays out in voting rights. Are there constitutional limitations on how disparate Black folk can be treated? And we looked at a lot of criminal justice. You know, why do we see the demographics on Skid Row rather, right here in LA, in the Nickel, right downtown? You go down there and you see that that in that fiercest expression of structural violence in America, the highest concentration of houseless folk in America, 75% of them are Black, right? You go into the prisons, when I take my students into San Quentin, you see a demography that looks very similar. You look at the places, you go to the emergency wards and look at the people on lung machines who are disproportionately dying from COVID, again, Black folk, overrepresented. So we've been trying to get at the causes of this plight, right? The fact that the income gap between Blacks and whites has not diminished in the last 50 years, despite the civil rights victories, and the wealth gap has even grown. How do we look at all of those kinds of factors and then say, what is an intervention that can address some of the root causes of all of those factors? What are some of the root causes? And one of the root causes we kept coming back to, of course, was resources, distributions of wealth and power, et cetera. So we get into that in a very direct way now with this reparations discussion. And I'm just gonna, I get to be, the nice thing about being a moderator is I get to be just a distributor. I get to distribute the rock. I don't want to bring up any basketball metaphor for LA fans who are kind of have long faces after this season, but I just get to bask in the insights of my colleagues here. So I'm going to start with a very simple and straightforward question, y'all, that I think a lot of people will have on their minds. There's the why of reparations and the what. Let's start with just what are reparations? If you had to kind of explain it to someone, and let's try, I'm just going to go down the line, kind of a 2-minute, or, getting on the elevator kind of version, or, so if you're trying to express to someone essentially the gist of this idea, how would you go about doing that? And I'm just going to go from my the left to right on my screen. I'll start with Ms. Holder.
I feel like a student in one of your classes. Reminds me of my first year in law school now. Cold.
Well, I don't mean, I should have given some trigger warnings.
Yeah. Okay, here's my elevator pitch. What is reparations? Reparations, emphasis should be on the word repair. So reparations in the context of African Americans is what interventions are needed to repair the damage done by 400 years of inequality, right? Beginning in 1619, through the end of slavery with the Civil War, going through Reconstruction and the complete disenfranchisement of African Americans in the Jim Crow segregation era, going to the civil rights and post-civil rights era, an era which many scholars called the new Jim Crow or Jim Crow Jr., where you still have systemic and structural racism that keeps African Americans back and that ensures that the playing field is not leveled. How do we repair all of that compounded damage, right? And so reparations is an analysis of how we repair that damage of 400 years of inequality. I'll make two addendums to that short explanation. One of the important insights that I believe reparations should always bring to bear is, in addition to redistributing resources and power in a way that's equitable and that makes up for the damages and the harms of 400 years of inequality, there also has to be a repair of the narrative. And when I talk about the narrative, I mean the story of America, the story of our history, which up until now has been a very Eurocentric, white supremacist leaning story and narrative. We need to repair that through reparations, which will involve creating a more inclusive, historically accurate narrative that includes the Black experience as part of the American experience. That's what reparations means to me.
Nice, thank you very much. I'm going to come back to that for sure. And I'm just making a quick note here so I don't lose that thread at all. All right. Ms. Grills, can you help us? Also, I'm trying to break this down to some folks and give them a succinct way of understanding it. What would you say?
Okay, so thank you again for this opportunity to share some thoughts. And I'm coming at this from the perspective of the only non-lawyer in the room. I'm thinking about this as a psychologist, and also to some extent, because I've spent the last 30+ years working very closely with community organizers, I'm coming at this also from an organizing perspective. So I would say my definition builds on the work of Alfred Brophy. So reparations for me ultimately is building a better future by correcting past injustices, which includes oftentimes a redistribution of wealth, power, and agency, right, in the present. Anybody who tries to give a precise definition usually has to address four things: what the reparations are, who's to provide, who ought to be provided with them, or who ought to provide them, I should say, and then who will receive them, and then what we might expect reparations to accomplish. So to go a little more precise with those caveats, reparations for me involves backward-looking and forward-looking efforts. Backward-looking meaning measuring past harm and correcting for it, and that includes things like truth and reconciliation, correcting the narrative. It includes apologies. It includes perhaps cash payments, correcting well-defined, identifiable past harm. And that's the tricky part, the well-defined, identifiable. Forward-looking means community building strategies and programs that are designed to promote the welfare of an entire community through actions like school reform and funding, housing. The goal in general is to, into the future, improve the lives of those who've been victimized by past harms. I believe both forward-looking and backward-looking approaches to reparations and doing what some people call corrective justice and distributive justice are necessary, and it's the way forward. In other words, how do we put Black people back in the position we would have been in absent enslavement, Jim Crow, systemic and structural racism, et cetera. And there's a lot to unpack just in that piece right there. So in conclusion, my elevator version, I got a long elevator, we got a lot of floors, is that reparations are responses, right? Programmatic, financial, and healing that are justified on the basis of past harm, the legacy of those harms, and continued harms. And these responses should be designed to assess and correct the harms in their multiple forms: material, psychological, emotional, societal, etc. And recognize that not just Black folk have been harmed, but everybody in our society has been harmed by enslavement and by the racialized DNA of this country. And so we have to think about how do we improve the lives of victims moving into the future, and help those who were not the direct victims but are indirect victims come to terms with how they've been victimized. And this process must include reversing harmful racial narratives, in part achieved through the truth-telling, the policies and the structures that are established to create and perpetuate exploitation and the racial hierarchies. And it must ensure that it will not happen again, right? This cannot be, every time we take a step forward, there's a backlash and we end up 3 or 4 backwards. It requires truth-telling from the top down, the bottom up, the inside out, as one person said in a meeting I was in earlier last week. And it must recognize that reparations in the US, and I have to emphasize this part, reparations in the US is not merely a local issue, it is a global issue. And we have to include a global analysis. We're at the 77th floor now.
Right on, love it, love it, yes. And so now I'm gonna pass the ball on to you, Mr. Miller, to, I know that you're now in the middle of writing about these very issues and have just written about them. And so, lawyers aren't known, we aren't known for our brevity, but if you were trying to succinctly get it in there, how would you do that?
Well, Dr. Grill's covered, I think, a bunch of points that I might have hit on. And so I just want to add, in addition to backward-looking corrective justice and forward-looking distributive justice, reparations for me is about transformational justice for victims and survivors of continuing serious intergenerational group harms. And to pick up on the social organizer front, reparations takes the form characteristically of a demand that the victims or survivors should be the ones to determine the remedy for themselves. It's a bottom-up, not top-down concept. And so reparations focuses not just, and perhaps not even predominantly, on rights. It focuses on wrongs and on power, and asks that the victims be given the power to determine for themselves how things ought to go. And that's a transformational part, because we don't want to go back to what was the corrective justice part. And what needs to be distributed is power, and the power for victims to determine for themselves a remedy. And I just want to again emphasize this idea of narrative. One of the ways in which victims are excluded, and we see this in Tulsa, the Tulsa race massacre, in which the state of Oklahoma acknowledged in a statute that it participated in silencing the victims and erasing them from history for 75 years, now going 100 years since the massacre. one of the major ways in which victims are disempowered is by being silenced. And so lifting up the voices of people excluded from our history and enabling them to participate as full members of our community is an essential part of reparations. There you go.
Great. The number of places that I see folks overlapping. I think I'll dive in first on where you started us, Attorney Holder, and that is the narrative. You know, how do we repair the narrative, the story of history? Right now, we have a lot of states around the nation who are very concerned about the history that's being taught in their schools, from the elementary right on up through the university level, and would say that a lot of the stuff that I've just heard should be subsumed under critical race theory of some kind, right? And that the narrative that you're proposing is a narrative that will villainize white folk, villainize little white kids, who are now seen as historical villains. And it will rob our countrymen and countrywomen of their patriotic zeal, because we're telling them that racism is at the foundation of the nation, right? And so, that's the narrative kind of we're up against. And as a lawyer, as a practicing lawyer, you know how important it is to control the narrative at trial and, and everywhere else you can. How do we push back against those kinds of arguments right now that, what we're talking about here is exclusionary. You're trying to exclude non-Blacks. We need to stop talking and thinking about race this much to overcome it.
Well, I'll steal a page from one of my mentors, Brian Stevenson, who, he was my professor in law school, and, he continues talking about what he talked about 20 years ago when he was my professor, about how in America, we've never had a true opportunity for growth as a nation. And because we've never given ourselves an opportunity to heal from America's original sin, which is slavery and legacies of inequality. We've never had an opportunity to have a truly robust discourse around those issues. And what I'll use the three words that are public enemy number one right now. What critical race theory does is that it starts to infuse that conversation into the national dialogue, right? It pushes to have that conversation so that we as a multicultural nation can finally start to heal and finally start to grow, to truly grow as a democracy, right? So narrative, right now we're having a war over what is the narrative, what should be the narrative. We're having all these memory laws cropping up all over the country and that are all about controlling the narrative, right? And really about controlling power. Who is going to have power in this country, and whose story or whose version of the story is going to dominate, right? And so what reparations does, in my perspective, is it seeks to share power through narrative, right? Through the way that we narrate our history, right? And so it seeks to be truly racially inclusive and to create a narrative that's founded on truth and inclusion. So.
Great. Professor Grills, the narrative that critical race theory actually did arise in response to was the narrative that started to emerge after the civil rights movement, after we had those crowning achievements of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 68 Civil Rights Act, housing. Here it comes, you know, there's Brown, there's Shelley, there's Loving, all of these crowning achievements. And yet, I remember Derek Bell saying this, and yet here we are in the early 80s, and for many Black folks, ain't nothing changed but what year it is.
Right.
Right? Ain't nothing changed but what year it is. So how do we explain this continuing racial inequality after colorblind formalism, after all this formal equality has been established? And one of the explanations was, hey, well, Black folks are just inferior. We're just genetically inferior, right? Society reflects biology. Biological determinism, right? Charles Murray in the Bell Curve put out a best-selling book on it. Quillette, you know, that magazine now constantly has a lot of skull measuring racists, you know, talking about, you know, biological differences. So that is the alternative explanation was, no, it's not the problem. Don't blame the victim isn't located in Black folks' inferiority, but in systemic factors, right? And how do we get that part of the conversation going? Because you're bringing, you know, you're bringing a strong background in psychology, which is really what we have lawyers try to dabble at, because we're trying to deal with the psychology of jurors and sometimes judges and others all the time. But, you know, you really studied, you're real, you know, how are we going to be able to move people? Is it an empathy thing to start to see things from a perspective that makes reparations make sense?
Yeah. Okay, how much time do we have?
I know.
Right. Well, let me say, and I was thinking about when you referenced Bell, of the work of a major giant in marketing, African-American man, and his name is escaping me at the moment, but when he, as he was, you know, kind of concluding his professional career, he wrote a book where he had a come to Jesus moment about, as a Black person in marketing, he used his understanding of Black folks to manipulate our buying habits, right? And he essentially said in his book, why after all of this time are we Black folks still at the bottom of every good list and the top of every bad list? And the Association of Black Psychologists, in collaboration with Community Healing Network, gave him an answer. And it's because if you actually look at it, and people have done this, these lists of all of these legislation and executive orders and legal victories, if you will, nothing has, you know, practically changed. And it's because we haven't dealt with the root cause of the problem. And the root cause of the problem is something that Attorney Holder has referred to, which is there's a mindset here. That mindset is fed by a narrative, but that mindset, which is in fact quite deadly, is the mindset of white superiority and Black inferiority. It is the root, right? And it is the thing that keeps reinforcing the behaviors, the attitudes, the policies and practices, and the lack of a real knowledge base in this country. We actually, I hate to say it, but we are a country full of pretty ignorant people. And when I'm saying ignorant, I mean ignorant of basic information. And that is intentional because it controls the community, it controls the society. So how do we begin to address this? From the point of view of psychology, we have to kind of reconcile the fact that all of us are feeling threat in some way, shape, or form. And that sometimes it's that threat that may fuel some of the anti-Blackness that we see. And so what's the threat for white folks? It is that somehow, you know, there's an existential crisis going on, and that my role in the world and my sense of my importance and contribution to the world may not be what I have been led to believe. And so if you take that away from me, what am I left with? And if the narrative that attempt to have dialogue leaves you only with a sense of your egregious entry, contribution to the world in terms of going everywhere and dismantling and taking and pillaging and raping, and I'm not going to go for that. So I'm going to fight it. I'm going to dig my heels in and be even more resistant to hearing a different narrative. So we got to recognize that we got to have these dialogues with an understanding of what each of us is bringing to the table, including our fears. But we also have to understand that what will probably bring us a step closer to, transformational narrative is finding out what are some of our actually shared concerns and needs that the false narrative is not going to allow to have any light in the day. So, Fred Hampton did this, Malcolm X did this, Dr. King did this. What did they do? They started trying to get white folks who are poor to understand, you know what, you're as much a pawn, not as much, but you're a pawn in this process as well. And, at the end of the day, we all need a different way of being in this world if we're going to have a quality of life. But the minute people start trying to bring us all together, that's when people start getting taken out and other kinds of things start happening to distract us. So I think we've got to come up with a way of understanding our shared experience. We got to be able to approach this narrative about reparations with the understanding that it was elite whites who were benefiting. And what was happening with the poor whites? You get people to start questioning that, you might actually get some traction.
Nice. Professor Miller, I'm going to assume for the sake of further conversation that we don't have to fight against, those who don't want to acknowledge that there is a legacy of racism, that this country has a history of racism, and that, we should have some kind of moral obligation, social responsibility to address that fact. I'm going to assume all that for the sake of further discussion now, and ask about how we operationalize this commitment now. How do, when we're getting down to the nitty gritty, in a state that says no affirmative action, right? For example, right, that says we're taking off the table certain principles or programs really that were meant to address some of these very kinds of systemic concerns. It was on the ballot this last November, as you know. It was rolled out late and was a horrible campaign for it, I think. I'm sorry if I'm stepping on toes, but I'm not blaming anybody. It was just too short and all that. And even with all of that, it passed in LA. In the city of LA, the majority of voters supported, were pro the affirmative action intervention, as in, also San Francisco, a few other spots. But given that that is the legal environment we're in, one that is hostile to affirmative interventions on behalf of marginalized groups in the name, at least, of affirmative action, what are some operational ways that we can, make reparations a reality?
You're not giving me the easy questions. So, so as I mentioned before, again, building on Dr. Grill's point that reparations is in part about corrective justice. One of the big differences between reparations and, for example, standard civil rights litigation is that reparations is a kind of wrongs-based understanding of racial equality. And so it shouldn't be understood. So you might think that, for example, affirmative action is a distributive justice plan. The idea is that what we need to do is redistribute the benefits of education more equitably around society. But one way in which reparations works is, for example, in the case of Japanese American internment, the Rosewood massacre, the Georgetown slavery victims. In all of these cases, scholarships are rolled out as one form of compensation. And the scholarships are compensation for past wrongs, not as essentially a form of distributive justice. And so I think we can think, and we ought to start thinking imaginatively about ways in which we can use the tools at our disposal to compensate, correct, transform, based on both the wrongs that have been done and the sort of transformation that we want to bring about. So for example, if LMU, Loyola Marymount University, my institution, and Professor Grill's institution can be shown to have engaged either as an institution or more broadly, certain parts of the institution in systemic oppression, then how do we correct for that? How do we make up for that wrong? Well, directing scholarships to the ongoing victims of those wrongs is one way to do it. The University of California could do the same thing. State university system could do the same thing. So there are a variety of ways in which we can go beyond a standard framework that focuses only on, as it were, race-based redistribution, but instead focus on wrong-based redistribution, where that wrong happens to have been done in a group-based, for example, in a race-based way. And so that's one way, just to answer one of the questions in the Q&A, that reparations, even if focused on African Americans, can also be more generally applied to other groups, Indigenous groups, and so on and so forth. And so I just think that we need to start thinking outside, and this is what reparations and critical race theory has been encouraging us to do since the 80s, 90s, and aughts, is not to be stuck within a traditional civil rights framework, but instead to think of other frameworks in which we can pursue transformational racial justice for African Americans.
Great. Let me go to the task force and ask for a moment our California Task Force on Reparations. How do you see it operating? Do you think it's an effective way to help to modify, alter the narrative? Do you expect it to bear fruit? That sort of thing. Why don't I, start that out with? I'll go to Attorney Holder and Professor Grills on that one. A task force. We're a collective task force. How will that move the ball? Will that help us move the needle?
Well, I'll jump in here, and just to also follow up on Professor Miller's point from a task force perspective and from a litigator's perspective. We're talking to lawyers here and litigators, and so our first instinct is always, well, let's bring a case. Let's bring a case, to get African-American reparations in California, et cetera. That's already been done, and the court's already said, no, that's something for the legislature to deal with. They passed the ball to the legislature. There's really, the legal structures, the jurisprudence is so rigid that there's really no mechanism for analysis of something like reparations for African Americans. So, the legislature has now taken up that mantle through AB 3121 in California and put together a task force, which includes Dr. Grills and myself and several other scholars and legislators, to analyze the case for reparations and how it can be made from a policy perspective, right? So that's why we have been convened as a group to analyze this issue over the next 2 years. And one of our tasks will be to not only think about it from at a scholarly level, at a very sort of conceptual, analytical level, but also to think about, okay, once we have recommendations, how do we implement them? How do we operationalize it? And that gets to your point, Professor Armour. And it is my belief that when you talk about implementing reparations, you have to approach it at 3 levels. You have to think about it at the level of the individual, the level of the community, and the level of the institution/structure, broader macro structure, right? And that's because harms over the last 400 years have been done on each of those levels, to the individual, to the African-American community, and to institutions by, creating mechanisms to exclude African-Americans, right? So that's how it has to be. It should be implemented and rolled out at those levels, and any plan for reparations, I believe, should consider institutional and structural resources being distributed, right? Like through tax credits, through things like scholarships, education plans and programs, but also through cash payments, that are focused more on the individual. So that's sort of my big picture perspective on how it's going to be rolled out and implemented. And now we just have to work for 2 years to get it right and get specifics.
Professor Grills.
So I agree with everything that Attorney Holder has shared. So I'm just gonna, again, invoke my psychology hat and perspective. From a societal perspective, from a societal level, and put that societal process in a historical context, I believe that a portal has opened, and that portal has created an opportunity, right? With, of course, a measured level of backlash and resistance. But the portal has opened because the society was in part forced to take the red pill and come out of the matrix and kind of see what the hell has been going on in the past and what's going on in the present. So you got George Floyd and the kind of increased consciousness about police abuse against the Black community. You see in real time the assault on voting rights, and you see in real time that COVID's impact on communities of color have laid bare all of the injustices of the past and the current manifestations of disproportionate and discrepant experiences and consequences of things. And so eyes are wide open. Now, we're gonna have to seize the moment because America's attention span is a little ADHD. It's like, it's open for a minute and then everybody turns to the next thing. And so while the eyes are wide open, we have the opportunity to engage a process to continue educating people about what happened and what's going on. We have an opportunity to correct the misperceptions that people have about reparations. In fact, those who are naysayers of reparations and are weighing in, we don't even really know necessarily if they know what they mean when they're talking about reparations, right? And so we need a level playing field of shared understandings of some basics. And so I think the task forces, one of the greatest tools that we will have available to us are these listening sessions that we're proposing will happen around the state that will allow for people to tell the story, will allow for the record to be corrected in terms of the historical realities and narratives, that will allow the fears and the concerns to surface and then have a real discussion, as opposed to, people are kind of like ready to form their argument and jump on to negate whatever points you're making. I think that if we can get to these listening sessions, we can get these things out, and we can then have the voiceless in the past actually be at the table, like as we were saying earlier, that the victims are the ones that should be defining the repair, that we will have a chance at not just doing something for California, but setting the stage for the country. And I'm reminded of what was one of the deciding features in reparations for Japanese Americans. It was the stories. The stories really shifted. And what moves our legislators? We think it's data. I'm afraid, but that many of their policies, decisions, they're are without data to drive them, but stories will get them. So we need to uplift those stories in very, very real ways.
Great. Professor Miller, could you give us a little bit of historical perspective, please, on this reparations fight and struggle? You have written, like I said, a lot about this, and I can't wait for your book that's coming out. But how to compare in the 2000s, for example, when there was talk at the federal level and so forth. How does the conversation then compare to the conversation you're hearing now in 2021?
Great. So just quickly before I get into that, I just want to give a shout out. Well, this can be part of the discussion, actually. So so one thing to recognize is that reparations, the demand that Black people in America get to decide for themselves what happens to them goes back to 1619. And we've seen the major location for reparations has traditionally been in classical and modern Black nationalism discussions, because as I mentioned at the beginning in my definition, reparations is about self-determination. And often that notion of self-determination is taken, it's a demand for sovereignty, right? It's a claim that I get to determine what happens to me. So we've seen with Delaney, you could think of as an early reparationist. You could think of Malcolm X in some ways as a reparationist. We should also recognize that a lot of Black women have led the reparations movement, from Callie House, who demanded pensions for formerly enslaved people, through Queen Mother Moore, who's perhaps the major figure in contemporary reparations dating back to the 60s and 70s. But your question was from 2000 to now. So in 2000, just to give an example of my involvement, along with Professor Charles Ogletree and Loyola Law School alumnus Johnny Cochran, we filed a lawsuit on behalf of 125 living survivors of the Tulsa race massacre. And that alleged traditional constitutional personal injury injuries, so Section 1983, for those of you who are lawyers, demanding that they get paid. The check that Lisa Holder was talking about was what we were asking for. And the city of Tulsa, our major obstacle was a statute of limitations. So the idea that we should have filed lawsuit 3 years after the massacre happened, we tried to toll the statute of limitations. So in other words, get it paused, using arguments made in Holocaust survivors' lawsuits just a few years before. The federal court refused to toll the statute of limitations, and the city of Tulsa waited for our 125 survivors to die off one by one, the last of whom died in September 2020 at the age of 100. So that was the standard state of play. We've heard a little bit about some of the lawsuits from Attorney Holder. in California. A bunch of them were filed in federal court and were variations of lawsuits that required the statute of limitations to be told. The current lawsuit in Tulsa is what's called a public nuisance lawsuit. And it does not have a statute of limitations, in part because we're claiming an ongoing harm against the community. So it's a community-focused rather than an individual-focused lawsuit. And it seeks an abatement of the harm, which means that the city of Tulsa, the sheriff's department, the county, all stop harming Black people in Greenwood and North Tulsa. And what does that mean? Well, it's all the sorts of things that Dr. Grills was talking about. They need to stop engaging in practices that undermine the health, the safety, the security, including the mental health of our clients. There is no hospital in North Tulsa. If you get ill in North Tulsa with a serious medical emergency, you have to wait for a hospital to come across, for an ambulance to come across town, pick you up, and then drive you back across town again. The mortality rate looks like something out of the 18th century rather than something out of the 21st century. And so what we are seeking is not just a cash payment. We have an unjust enrichment claim that seeks the cash payment that Attorney Holder is looking for. What we seek is a transformation of the institutions that serve the people of Greenwood and North Tulsa. And so, and part of the goal of that, and this hopefully answers one of the questions in the Q&A from Steve Road, is we seek the, so we're reaching out to the descendants. We've got 3 survivors, we're reaching out to the descendants, and we're asking them to engage in this process and tell us what they want the city to do. This has to be a bottom-up project in which the injured group, the survivors and the descendants, determine for themselves what the outcomes are. And we got a real fight with a bunch of people about giving a voice to the survivors and letting them determine what they get to do with money that might be provided to them, with services. And so I had the luck when I was down in Tulsa. It turns out that the actress Alfre Woodard is a descendant, and bumped into her. She had a lot to say, very powerful things to say about how things ought to go. And so if there are descendants in California of the Tulsa Race Massacre, I think we're going to get a link posted in the chat. Reach out to us and tell us your story, your family story, and how you want things to go, because our litigation, our activism is all about empowering the people who have been impacted, not telling you what ought to happen, but you telling us what ought to happen. So hopefully that explains the differences between the 2 lawsuits. One was top down in the 2000s. We're very much looking for grassroots, bottom up input.
Thanks so much. I think we're running close to the time, aren't we, Olivia? Do we only have an hour?
Yes, so we end at 1 o'clock. Thank you, Professor Armour. Do you want to ask the final question?
One kind of quick question, yes, that I hope I can get maybe a quick response to, because Demiana asked it, and it's one that comes up in a lot of these discussions about how the program defines a reparations program will define who should be eligible, who has the applicant's qualification for reparations. You know, does it go to American descendants of slaves? Does it go to Black folk more generally? You know, you take somebody like Amadou Diallo, he was shot in vestibule, a brother immigrant from Africa, but from, the perspective of the street police, he was just a Black man, right? So how do we think about the basic, that kind of basic qualifications question? Professor Miller?
I'm going to jump in because it may be a controversial one for the task force participants to answer. So just speaking for me, the wrong determines the remedy and the party injured. And so we can talk about reparations back then, and we can talk about reparations right now. And so reparations for descendants for the harm of slavery is going to go to a large extent to the descendants of enslaved people. Why? Because if we're cutting a check to make up for the harm of slavery, then it's going to go to the descendants of enslaved people. Now, we can also say that there are some harms that come from the narratives, let's say, of slavery that apply to Black people everywhere. And so maybe for that harm, that's a different harm. The harm of redlining, right, is a Jim Crow thing, maybe a contemporary thing, not a slavery thing. And so we ought to look to the victims of redlining. The victims of policing in Los Angeles are if we just look at a case you'll probably be familiar with, City of Lions versus Los Angeles, the famous chokehold case, which detailed 19 people, African Americans, killed by chokeholds, is going to be the victims of the chokeholds or the victims of policing who are contemporary African Americans from all over. The cops don't ask whether you're descended from slaves or not, who get those reparations. So for me, remember, I defined reparations as a continuing serious intergenerational group harm. I'm just asking for reparations right now. If there's a continuing serious intergenerational group harm, policing might count for that, where slavery also counts as a different type of continuing serious intergenerational group harm. And so who benefits is going to be different. The victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre may have been recent immigrants to the country in 1921 who had no connection to slavery at all. They still should get compensated. And so depending on the wrong, that'll tell us the nature of the remedy and who gets the remedy.
Yes, it looks like we only have a very brief few seconds, Olivia. I don't know if I can ask and stay within the limits, but I am anyway. I'm going to ask Attorney Holder and Professor Grills if you can just take us out with a few thoughts about, to some law students, lawyers, do you have high hopes for what the task force can accomplish, what you'll be able to do in moving the needle for us as Californians on the task force?
Just very briefly, I think it's a phenomenal group of people that the Secretary of California and the governor have put together to be on this task force. A lot of thought is going into it, and we take our role as trustees so seriously, and we understand the gravity of the role. So I feel so confident that the task force will actually get things done, and actually deliver a reparations plan. That's my take on things. We are working on it, and we will bring a plan forward and push it forward.
And then I'll just quickly say, I'm going to invoke one of the sayings of the Army Corps of Engineers: we have to act as though it's impossible to fail. So I believe we will succeed, and out of respect for the memory of my ancestors who made a way out of no way and worked with far less and accomplished a lot, that their descendants and this committee, this task force, can get something accomplished. I have to believe that in order to keep going.
Gabriella, Olivia, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for always, bringing these discussions and conversations together. I know it's a lot of work. People don't have any idea how much heavy lifting, grunting, and sweating goes on, but much appreciated. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. And I just wanted to make a quick announcement that this is obviously a discussion that needs further unpacking. We actually are planning an event later on discussing exactly how we should define who receives reparations, kind of focusing on those last couple questions we got from our moderator. So stay tuned for those. We have the next next Racial Justice in the Law series event in September on health equity. So stay tuned for that as well. Thank you all for supporting and joining our panel. And also, sorry, one more thing, we're actually going to have an event on Indigenous rights and land back, which is reparations and land back for Native American individuals as well. So keep an eye out, and thank you all for joining us today. The recording of this event will be posted on YouTube. So thank you all for joining us, and stay tuned. Bye now.